professor in City University at the Centre for Software Reliability, and at the same time he is the. Are you CEO, Robin? Is that your role there? No, it's. Anyway, he's the founder of Adelard, certainly, who's been working in safety critical systems for probably longer than both of us would care to recall. And he's going to talk to us about some new work on assurance and the impact of artificial intelligence and machine learning on regulation. So there we are. We're at start time, Robin. So off you go. And thanks very much for agreeing to talk today.
Great. Well, thanks, Stuart, and good afternoon, everybody. So as Stuart said, it's the first lot of talking. I seem to have somebody with a power tool outside. If it gives a problem, then just shout, please, Stuart. So I'm going to give this talk, which is it's talk in two parts really, but obviously related. One's around assurance, and the other is around sort of impact of AI and ML on machine learning on regulation. So what I'm going to do first of all is to give you some perspectives on governance and regulation. These are quite old, quite enduring in some way, but give us a little bit of a lingua franca. And I realise I've got a wonderfully broad audience here from those who know the area very well. So some of you who are coming at it with a lot of different technology or research backgrounds. And so I'll give that brief perspective first. And then I'm going to talk about Assurance 2.0, introduce it, and then talk a little bit about a study that we've done on the impact of AI and machine learning on safety regulation. And then I'm very happy to be interrupted as I go along, speed up, slow down, all that type of stuff. So at a starting point, we often talk about an assurance case being something, some document and a collection of evidence that allows us to make a decision about whether something is safe or whether something is secure, whether something is trustworthy in the broad sense. And to do this, this is a socio-technical issue or socio-technical political issue, actually. And to do this, we need to both communicate, we need to reason, and we need to understand. And so we have this, often we have this tension between being able to communicate well, but also we need to reason in detail and we need to understand. So those are sort of three key things. The other three things that we like to talk about, this isn't threes actually, no, maybe it's four, the next slide, is to think about a strategy triangle to understand how people are addressing assurance. So are they having a standards-based approach? So obviously compliance with standards and the assessment of importance of non-compliance. Is it more property or behavior focused, looking at functionality, correctness, that type of thing? Or are they looking at absence of defects, absence in certain classes of faults, such as runtime errors, certain sorts of vulnerabilities? So you have these three strands to any assurance, and that applies to, I think, to machine learned systems and AI, just as it does to ordinary computer-based systems or other technical systems. And we also have safety principles, and then there's this sort of interrelationship between the role of standards, particularly in vulnerability assessment, and these three properties three parts of the triangle I was talking about. So you might say that, we might have some principles which says, yes, the system has got to behave in the way that we expect it, so we've got adequate behavior. But also you might have a principle that the design aesthetic is satisfactory. So we often get asked, can you analyze this system and assure it to death? Well, we'll say, well, yes, we can, but it's awful. And we think there is a level upon which, you should have nice design if it's going to affect people's lives. And then there's the compliance with standards. Sometimes that's seen as a obeying authority type of thing, role. Other times you might say, well, applying with standards, it actually gives me a surrogate for saying whether the system is behaving all right. I can infer good behavior because I've complied with the standard. And of course, that all depends on the strength and the provenance of the standard. And then the next thing is a very simple model. And again, I apologize to those of you who are used to far more complicated things. But again, this is a model that we use for communication, where we think of systems as quite straightforwardly either being in an okay state, transitioning to an erroneous state, and then having two transitions either to safe or dangerous, or insecure or secure. And so you can then see different people's approaches according to how they prioritize these different areas. So, for example, some people might not care at all about how unavailable the system is. They might be, because they know if they reach an error state, they can bias the failure towards safety. So fail stop, for example. Things on the ground are quite good at failing stop. Things in the air probably much harder. Other people are really concerned will say, well, we don't really know the consequences of any of this, so we're going to focus on fault activation. So we have the former methods people. Let's get rid of all fault errors to start with, and then we don't need to worry about whether we are going to dangerous or safe. And then we have the fault tolerant community who say, well, no, actually what's important is being in the erroneous state for as short a time as possible and correcting. Now, of course, you can have different strategies for different classes of fault, but in a way you can use this, certainly if you're interested in sort of how people's work relates to each other, you can position people on this diagram to say, well, how does your research, which bit of this are you focusing on? And then lastly, this simple idea, another enduring idea that of claims, arguments, evidence is important. And at one level, you can take this quite superficially. Claims are things you're trying to, assertions put forward for general acceptance, if you use the Tolman language. Evidence is things you use as a basis. If obviously in a legal environment, actually arguing quite what evidence is, quite what the facts are, you can take a long time doing that. And technical areas, it may be quite easy to establish what the facts are. And then arguments is the inference which links these things together. Again, a simple vocabulary, but this is the way we find, again, for talking about your research, well, quite what claim is it that you guys are going to substantiate when you've done, when you've completed what you're doing. And so the CAE stuff, is claims evidence, has been around for a long time, and it's used on lots of systems, whether they're underground or in the air, or sort of whether they're medical. So there is a sort of maturity behind it. But when we are investigating it, and there are various documents, there's one we've done on connected automotive ecosystems, there's the IEA guide on dependability. So there's sort of guidance and industry sort of application of these things. And there's an Adelard tool, so a little bit of advertising. We have a tool that supports all this. I'm very happy to make it freely available for research projects and things. But we need to go from these concepts into engineering, to doing real systems. So we need methods and tools for reasoning and communication, and we need methods and tools for system analysis and development. And often the cases we get are going to be, well, always the cases we get pretty much are going to be this mixture of sort of narrative and some sort of graphical visual summary of these. And most of these things, I put one of our examples from our help file as of old. None of these examples normally stand up to a lot of scrutiny. You'll say, well, why? What the heck? Why is it done like this? Why do these three things make that thing? What does that matter? So you get a sort of good in a way of communication. You can see traffic lighting, you can sort of see what the main issues are. But in terms of reasoning and in terms of supporting the assurance, you rely on narrative, and often narrative has all the strengths and weaknesses that we know it has. So we're often asked what good looks like, and again, this is another bit of my socio-tech thing, of which I guess I'm grateful to Edinburgh, because it was the Dirk project in Edinburgh which really sort of gave me my sort of socio-technical sensitivity. What good will look like is very context dependent. So we taught some of this stuff to some children in schools, and we asked them about claim. What is their claim? And the left-hand side is, I claim that I've got 3 huskies. They have an overarching claim, so they literally have an overarching claim, and they have evidence which is supporting the claim, which is these lovely feet or hands pushing it up. So that's really, really nice bit of communication, much better than the sort of stuff that comes out of our tool. They've got their point across. But again, there's issues of scale, issues of reuse, issues of communication. So why do we want to change this? So why have we come up with Assurance 2? Well, trustworthy systems are expensive and often slow to produce, and we still know they have failures. I mean, not that these systems are ever said to be perfect, but they have more failures than we would like. An assurance is essential for gaining confidence in a system for all sorts of reasons, legal, reputational, and assurance can be slow and produce, and particularly slow to change, particularly if you're in a regulated industry. And we have these innovation opportunities, new life cycles, new technologies, higher tempo, varied supply chain, increased threats. So all these things are providing, I think, drivers for change. And this idea of cases and claims, arguments, evidence is picked up in lots of emerging requirements for safety assurance and arguments, whether it's in the ISO automobile standards, whether it's in the autonomous driving UL standard, whether it comes in the regulation for the white paper. So in a way, we've been successful at saying, yeah, this is the way to go. We want outcome-based claims, arguments, evidence. But then how do you do it? And how do you do it in a way which is thorough enough? So from a personal point of view, challenges from broadening approach often come from looking at security and engineering justifications out of the non-safety world. So it's, the people outside of this, where we're using it in different applications, looking at design of plant, from different disciplines point of view, looking at security. And we've had a long-term study, meaning 5 to 10 years now, looking at adoption of this in industry and seeing how people have been using it. The other one driver is looking at, well, okay, this stuff's mature, but there's a commoditization of risk assessment. And for those of us in the security area, we know that about the NCSC withdrawal of risk assessment guidance, which was a fairly conventional, fairly well-regarded guidance. And my reading of that is it's because, in a way, people lost the mindset. So the methodology didn't capture the mindset, or people had lost that. And I think this is particularly true when we see the challenge of autonomous systems. And as I was chatting to Stuart, some of you might have heard to start with, the challenge of automated certification. And indeed, there's also lots of research on argumentation and assurance that we want to exploit. So that's sort of some of the drivers for where we are. And so what we've been developing is this idea that we've called Assurance 2, because it's sufficiently different from what's gone before that we think it can do with a new name. And this is joint work with John Rushby of the SRI, who some of you know. So the claim here, and this is a claim at this stage, is that we can make assurance an enabler of innovation, not a brake. I get very excited about assurance. We get companies with new products coming to us. If they can assure it, then they can innovate and they can affect the market. So it's really, it should be at the heart of innovation, is being able to assess how trustworthy something is. And slightly paradoxically, we think we can do this by making it more rigorous. So we keep the structure of cases, we strengthen the focus on evidence and reasoning, we bring forward the thinking in the life cycle, and we support assurance with the best practices. And so we actually reduce choice. We reduce all these free-form cases and the do-it-as-you-like type of approach. So that's the sort of manifesto part of it. And so what does this look like? Sorry, I'm just... Great, sorry. Okay, so the manifesto, how do we do this? And I'll do the bullet points, and then I've probably got about a slide on each of these things, so to elaborate them. So first of all, we want to make explicit inference, and we want to make separation out about inductive and deductive reasoning, and something I think the pejorative term from philosophers, but actually what we're doing is natural language deductivism for some of this argument. We want to use explicit use of doubts and defeaters. Now, clearly people have always reviewed their work and what have you, but we want to be more explicit in the use of defeaters and into feasibility. And then we want to focus on the evidence integration, looking at both the relevance and provenance of evidence. And then the idea being that once we can get a certain level of confidence in the evidence, we hope to produce a deductive core for the argument. We've been experimenting with the use of confirmation theory, which is something you don't see very much out in the wild. And we're using that and also the use of counter cases, trying to make the opposite claim to try and reduce bias. So you can see we're trying to develop this sort of technical framework, which is broad enough to deal with real world problems, but also we need to think about bias and how we sort of position that within the overall process. And then this recognition all along that it's not just methodology, it's also mindset. And again, trying to articulate that is something quite hard, but it's something important. So the building blocks are based on this type of pattern where we have claims and we have subclaims. So we have claims of these assertions, things we're putting forward as true, we're exploring. We have subclaims, which are other true and false propositions, and then we just make explicit the inference rule with a side warrant in Tolman's vocabulary that allows us to make that transition, that inference from the subclaims to the claim. And of course there has to be a narrative behind this type of thing to explain what's going on. But the idea here is that we can use the side warrant to make this as deductive as possible and inductive as necessary, and I'll talk a bit more about that. So many of you on the call will know much more about logic than I do, but just this idea of separating out deductive arguments which logically entail the conclusions and provide some sort of guarantee of the truth from an inductive argument which provides some degree of support or degree of strength. This is something which is mixed. It's mixed a lot in many applied work, and so these two things are very different. The confidence you can get from a deductive argument and from a inductive one is very different. So just one slight sideways thing here. Why do we separate them out? Well, it's not just our idea. There's a nice paper on Cormac Hurley on science security and elusive goal of security as a scientific pursuit, which talked about this failure to observe this split as being repeated failure is one of the lessons one should learn from the history and philosophy of science when it comes to security. And you can see people confuse the two. You can see wonderful deductive proofs of crypto algorithms, but what about the validity of those within the real world? And so why we want to do it is because there is an efficiency here, apart from the confidence you can gain from deduction, is that if you look at this little thing we're trying to do in the middle here, if you've got it, so all our arguments about the real world, so in some sense all our arguments are inductive. So if you can split that into a deductive argument plus another inductive argument, if that inductive argument B is easier than inductive argument A, then we've gained. And that's really the key to this approach. But then we've made progress. So for example, we might have some deduction about some property. So we might have a deductive argument that a property like confidentiality distributes over a particular architecture. Well, that gives us very strong leverage. We then just have to show in the real world, the inductive argument does confidentiality distribute in the real world in that way. But if it does, then we can divide and conquer and help ourselves there. So that's part of it. The next thing is from work that my colleague did in Adelard and my colleague in City when she was there, Kate Nechikova, is identified these 5 building blocks. This is quite a strong claim, but we say, well, actually, most assurance arguments you can be built up with these five components, and this is just empirical. This isn't, there isn't a theory of the world which says these are all necessary, but it's effectively decomposition, which is divide and conquer, either a property or an object. Substitution, use that where you're going from a claim about one object into a claim about another. You talk about a claim about a simulated object as opposed to the object in the real world, or in property terms, you had my colleague Lorenzo Strugini talking, you might talk about a worst case bound as opposed to some distribution. Evidence incorporation is the other one, getting close to the evidence, probing it, what exactly is it telling us, And then concretion, which is really making something which happens a lot, which is where some aspect of the claim is given a more precise definition. So a lot of regulations might be cast in terms of words like adequacy or things where you really need to concrete before you can demonstrate them. And calculation or proof is a sort of decomposition block where you have values being propagated as well as the true cause thing. So this simple idea of 5 things, we have the so-called helping hand, is really quite radical because it should help us with synthesis, because the question is just which block do I use next, as opposed to I've got a complete white blank canvas here, what do I do? And so we found in the teaching that this is indeed very helpful. And so what you might begin with then, just very quickly looking at the time here, you might have think about some software contribution to risk to life being acceptable. And so you then might do some concretion of what you mean by risk to life by defining something in a more quantified and defined way. And then you need a side claim of safety analysis and what have you, justifying that, or indeed some whole lot of discussion, which would then become a subcase underneath that. You then might, well, I'm going to substitute for my software contribution to risk to life with some safety properties meeting a reliability target. You might from there have a substitution about adequately confident, no critical defects. So here we're using substitution very explicitly to go from different types of models of requirements, models that link defect freeness to reliability, models of system and safety analysis, model of overall system and safety. And then each of these side claims, which with themselves need to be elaborated. And so how cases look then is you if you like have a core, which you do by substitution, concretion, decomposition. You have then the side claims, which you then scaffold and buttress your case with. So the other bit of language we've introduced is the language of defeaters. People love defeaters actually, because they're always good at saying what's wrong with what they're doing, and actually giving them a framework within which to express that is helpful. Initially, we talk about, in the manifesto, talking about rebutting defeaters and undercutting defeaters, rebutting ones giving us negation of the conclusion, and undercutting ones just sort of undermining our confidence in it. In practice, when you identify a defeater, you don't really know what it is until you've analysed it. So there aren't actually particularly different methods for these. So something we found in practice. But identifying and mitigating defeaters is foundational to assurance, and it gives us that stopping rule. The rule, interfeasibility is when we've defeated it as hard as we can, and we're satisfied with the case. And as I mentioned, defeater workshops, very human-centered activity. We've been running these things online, using collaboration tools in a way just as you would with hazard analysis. So some of you from the safety world or the hazard world, defeaters are to arguments what hazards are to systems. So we're adapting some of the same approaches to that multidisciplinary brainstorming type approach initially. And then in all of this, theories become very important. So we talked a bit about become more explicit with these differences between the worlds. And so if you have one, so this example here comes from maybe an avionics example where people are looking at, are the low-level requirements are traceable to high-level requirements? And you want to say something like the low-level requirements are necessary, or you might have some property there. And the idea here is that you need a theory, because normally people give you something measured. So I've passed 25 tests, or I've got some, I've benchmarked my object recognition system a certain amount of time. You want to go from something measured to something useful. And so theory is what you need in your side claim here. You need a theory to actually do that for you. And as part of that, we want to be able to assess the strength of theories. And so the other part of the experimentation we've been doing is using confirmation measures. And and this is part to either directly on evidence or on a theory to see how strong that theory is. And so we take the confirmation measure. This is Kemeny and Oppenheimer's measure, where we look at what's the probability that you see the evidence if the claim is true minus what's the probability you see the evidence the claim is false. So the one reason for using this is it's symmetrical, so that you are asking people to look at things from the other point of view. And so we've had mixed experience with this, but it does allow people to explore how surprising it would be to see that evidence anyway, and forcing them to think about counterclaims. And we do this normally informally or qualitatively. And then you can use that to challenge. For example, you've got some theory of traceability, so how do you so you might challenge that. And the Kemeny and Oppenheimer isn't the only measure out there, and there's a I won't go into those details now. And lastly, counter cases. So we had this sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek article in the IEEE about where we do, is chocolate good for you or is chocolate bad for you? So we've got a little bit of experience now with different groups doing cases and counter cases and seeing where the bias is there bias there or not. Great, and then lastly, to wrap up this part a bit, confidence, of course, is fundamental, and it's the question we ask ourselves about a system, and it has to, the assurance case has to inform the decision making that's going to be made. And so we have these three perspectives on confidence. There's a positive one, the extent to which we can justify belief in its claims. We have the soundness from the natural language deductivism, and then we have probably maybe some probabilistic valuation, maybe using one of the conservative Bayesian frameworks there. But again, because we've got our 5 argument blocks, because we've got the natural language deductivism, we think we're avoiding some of the issues found by Graydon and Holloway in confidence propagation approaches. We then have a negative view, to the extent to which we've investigated and addressed our doubts. So our doubts become defeaters, we sharpen them up, we record them in the case, we have that sort of dialectic of defeaters, addressing defeaters and changing the case. And then after all of that, we need assess some sense the residual risks. And there are, if you like, an experimental that, some risks might be so small we don't worry about, some risks we are small but we want to, might be immeasurable, we want to make sure they don't aggregate, and then it's significant ones that we need to quantify. So that's a very quick, rather conceptual view through of assurance 2. The basic concepts of claims, arguments, evidence, the use of blocks, the use of defeaters and confidence, the role of evidence, and our explicit approach to bias. Does it work? Well, it's work in progress. We have a number of systems that we've been working on with it. We've developed some autonomous systems, templates and guidance, which is up on archive if you're interested. I've got a link in a moment. We have got tool support we've been developing. And interestingly, we've been teaching the concepts to professional engineers and managers. We've got many disciplines, and we've now got about 120 people through this course. And we're following up to see how they use it in all sorts of ways. That's just the link to the safety case templates. It's a DSTL sponsored research based on top of work we did for CPNI and DFT.
Robin, there's a couple of questions in the chat, and I just wondered whether you wanted to deal with them now or leave them to the end. I mean, it's up to you, actually, I think. Let's
have a go at them now. I can't.
You want me to say them?
So let's see. So one's about how do we know we identified all defeaters? Okay.
Yeah, and then there's another one on iterative theory revision. Can you see them both?
Yeah, I'm just having a think about them. So,
okay.
So one of the drivers is to try and make things more, to increase the tempo of things, and it depends quite what do you mean by the theory that's being revised. So if you've got one of these substitutions between one world and another, and you're having to iterate your theory because of some problems with your theory, doesn't match the real world, then yes, then of course that's really useful, and you can either do that through adding different claims or introducing different evidence. But clearly, if you're having to revise how you think the world behaves, you think that actually this property doesn't distribute across your architecture, then you've got to think again, either with the assurance or with the design. You might have a wonderful proof for certain classes of architectures, for example, and it just doesn't match the architecture that's out there because it hasn't been implemented in that way. You get that with security properties and things like that. On the other hand, if the theory is about revising the evidence or revising strength of it, then that would make a different type of change. So all of these things are welcome, and it might end up with a defeat, and it might just come in as a defeater, which you then have to sentence. The other question from Robabia is, how do we make sure we've identified all defeaters? Well, we don't, I think, so you think of this in a way a bit like hazard analysis. You could identify perhaps all classes of defeater from experience, from standards. Whether you've identified all instances of that which are relevant, you might not know. And so you need to then take that into account, saying, well, how are my controls sufficiently generic that if other things come along I haven't thought of, will they actually help? Not. As a slight aside, I'm on a task force on quantum communications and what the government should do about it. And this is one of the things I've been thinking about, going into a subject of which I know absolutely nothing. Brings up these issues of sort of how do you tackle that new type of topic. So some of these things about the real world, so they are empirical, but we might have evidence about classes of things. Okay, thanks. Shall I carry on then?
Yeah. Sorry, Robin. I was just.
No, that's good.
Carry on.
So, yeah, I won't talk about the templates. So the templates are all work in progress. They're a couple of years old now, but it's quite worth a read if you want some background or you want to know what are the misconceptions industry people have. We take quite a, so on this and other work we've done for DFT, I think we took quite a low view really of some of the autonomous systems research and how it can be what we can trust from it. So standing back a little bit, we're now interested in what's the impact on safety and regulation of. So we've got this assurance framework, which we think is fairly general purpose. But then, well, what about this topic which you're all engaged with? What's its impact on safety and regulation of AI and ML? And there's two ways of, broadly speaking, of course. It can both. We've got the problem of how to assure these products that use these technologies, and also how might we use these technologies to help assurance of other things. And so I guess some of you will be familiar, but there's something called the Safety Assessment Principles for Nuclear Facilities. And these are about 200 pages of principles, and it follows the UK approach of regulation, of having outcome-focused regulation rather than telling you exactly what colour you should have here and what width of cable you should have there. So what we did in this project was to try and look at the suitability of that regulation. The first look at it really from our side, looking at, is it appropriate for artificial intelligence and machine learning operations? And so We looked at the issues of standards and guidance, because in industry and regulated areas, standards are really important. We looked at architectural and assurance techniques. We looked at were there any, if you like, ideas looking at that we want the regulations to enable the benefits of this technology because it can enhance safety and it can enhance security. So how might that happen? Looked at how we might improve the regulatory guidance, and are there any constraints that we've identified, and how do we want to shape research in the future? But that was the type of questions we're asking. And so we did this by effectively going through and evaluating the impact on nuclear regulation but in two particular areas, looking at fundamental principles, looking at understanding the explainability of AI, reliability issues, the two-legged approach, which I'll say something about, to computer-based systems, human factors, security and safety cases, and data management. And the outcome of it is a provisional route map in this area. And so the fundamental principles, and again, are things like this. So duty holders must demonstrate effective understanding and control of hazards. And then there might be another one, an engineering principle, which I'll elaborate in a moment, around computer-based systems. But if we just look at that one, I mean, this is where I could need some help from this research project. How do we calibrate what is understanding? What does it mean for an organization to understanding? How do you say, well, I sufficiently understand this AI and ML system that it's that I can trust it? Why is that different from whether you understand probabilistic fracture mechanics and concrete? What is it? What are the core things to demonstrate understanding, and can we then apply those to any technology? So those are the sort of questions that it's bringing up. And similarly, when it comes to computer-based systems, the nuclear industry has this approach, the so-called two-legged approach, where first of all they justify production excellence. So looking at have people tried really hard and have they produced really, really great development artifacts. And then there's independent confidence building measures, ICBMs, and if any of you not in the nuclear industry might confuse those, but these are really important ways. So my colleagues might do static analysis, we might look for vulnerabilities in devices, you might do statistical testing of software. So all these things are rather providing with some direct evidence of suitability. And one can imagine from this perspective, AI ML as just being complex software. If it's just complex software, complex digital system, does this approach apply? And so what we did in the study was looked at AI ML systems from these two views. I've also talked about software-centric view, but you can also look at it from an anthropomorphic view and say, well, okay, these systems might be like operators, they might have levels of autonomy and authority. So you could look at the sort of human factors aspects of the safety principles to say, well, do they apply to these systems? And that's what we did initially. So the type of things that come up is you really begin to challenge the meaning of the existing regulations. So for example, okay, so we're going to use standards to say whether something is excellently produced. Well, what's the rationale for accepting a standard? Is it just consensus? I mean, where's the validation evidence for the existing standards? It's often pretty lacking. But if we've got a new standard, I mean, we did a survey of AI ML standards actually, and there's every man and his dog are writing standards in this area at the moment. But how do we know one of those has the authority and also the validity to be used? And then also we have certain regulatory issues about, well, how are the standards actually used? If we use an outcome-based approach, so we'll use a two-legged one, well, how might we assess generic tools and data? So all the issue around platforms become important here. And so, as we move from systems that might need massive amount of testing and independent assurance to platforms which might need much less, it takes only 70 hours to get a pilot's license or something like that, or whatever it does to fly general aviation. So there's an example of a human platform which really doesn't need very much training to do something very complicated. And then how do you evaluate reliability of these systems? And again, so what confidence do we need in our existing reliability assessments? And then how do the plethora of benchmarks and metrics relate to the nuclear application? So these are some of the issues that comes up here. And then understanding. So there's this issue of, would these systems undermine the responsibility of duty holders? So if an autonomous system makes a mistake, who's going to be responsible for that role? Would it undermine a licensee's responsibility? And in this issue that I brought up earlier, which I'd great to get one of your broad socio-technical views on this, what does it mean to understand? Should we assess understanding explicitly, or do we do it through surrogates? So that's... And then when we get to safety analysis and requirements, this is getting into more of the technical details, but if we have, does traditional hazard analysis and all the techniques we use, does it, and traditional human factors analysis, does that apply to these AI/ML systems to consider their usability? Is diversity and defense and death principles, can they be readily applied? And in an industry that's regulated issues of classification of functions and equipment, can it cope with these new levels of autonomy that you might have? So these are really, it's that sort of study of raising these type of questions, which doing two things: is actually probing existing practice and the meaning of it, and also saying, well, does this apply to your new systems? And then we talk about the actual guidance and assurance structures themselves. So what comes out of this type of discussion? This slide probably isn't very readable, but I just wanted to give you the overview of it. It is a sort of route map in development, and looking at these effectively 5 areas, looking at the regulatory capability and frameworks. So that's partly the guidance, partly the capability and technical analysis. Looking at analysis techniques and evidence generation. So if we're going to, so what do we want to have when it comes to this domain? What about architectural approaches, and particularly what about data? So one of the main areas where that challenges the regulations is data, and that's haven't talked very much about that because it was pretty much missing from the existing regulations, other than in a fairly minor way. So there are these themes that, the use of data, the provenance of data, the vulnerability of data, how we assess it, all of that is a big theme, a big cross-cutting theme. And then there's standards. I've talked a bit about that, but how do we get standards which are validated and what can we claim for the fact that we've actually used them? So those are some of the issues that we have there. And wrapped up in all of these are issues of algorithm supply chains, data supply chains, the data properties that we want, how do we trial things out, how do we capture experience from different sectors and things like that. So that gives you a bit of a flavour. So I have my eye on the time here, Stuart, not too much. So in terms of the conclusions then, I sort of gave you some sort of ideas at the beginning to sort of help frame the discussion, our perspectives on assurance and regulation, and then talked about assurance too, some of our drivers for it and what the key concepts are in it, and then talked about this preliminary work we've done on the impact of AI/ML on nuclear safety regulation. So very happy to discuss.
That's great. Thank you, Robin. Yeah, I think we should all give you some virtual applause. Yeah, probably that's the next thing to do. Yeah, here we are. I mean, I have, as is kind of my duty, I think, is hosting these things. I have a few questions, but I don't want to dominate. So we'll throw it open there, and do people have questions they would like to ask? There's a stunning silence at the moment. Okay, I mean, I've got a simple one to begin with, Robin. You talked about what is it to understand, yeah? And I wondered to what extent you'd already done some things about that sort of thing, because it occurred to me that when you start to look at, say, defeaters, for example, if you know how to change something in order to overcome a defeater, yeah, in some sense you understand that thing, yeah, and you probably understand the argument in some sense that the defeater has defeated. So, I mean, have you looked at that? Because in some way, how do you understand it? Well, you know how to fix it, yeah. Would be the kind of commonplace argument that I would put forward for that. And have you thought anything about that sort of thing?
I think that's so sort of the indefeasibility as being where you end up understanding something. I think that's a great idea. I think often it depends how good the defeaters are, I suppose, in a sense of are they coming from someone. So if they're coming from people, so when we had our defeater workshops, people came up with lots of problems they'd had on other systems, or they have in other generic issues which they then relate to this, or they had experiences. So in sentencing them, you've really got. So you could sentence them from a point of ignorance and say, well, actually, this doesn't apply to my system. So if you didn't understand the system, you could sentence defeaters wrongly. On the other hand, the attack that these defeaters had, if they are well judged, then that will certainly demonstrate your understanding and your ability to articulate that. But if people just dismiss things out of scope, then that might be harder to counter.
Okay. The other thing I wondered around that was the extent to which you see defeaters being generic. I mean, are there kind of recipes for defeaters for certain classes of systems?
Yes. So some of you will know. Kevin Driscoll, who developed the safe bus 777 and the Byzantine fault tolerance, he had a project from NASA to document things that go wrong with 10⁻⁹ systems, and that's up on the web. And so you could imagine that there would be some generic things, but I think it's quite nice research topic to say, well, is there something special about the defects and the problems you get left with? Or are they actually, so are they all unique? And so you can't really learn from each of these unique things. And so it doesn't really help you with the next system. Or is there something about these which you can generalize slightly? And so just going back to a project we had with an aircraft manufacturer. So if you find a mistake in a design issue, so this guy, they'd put, I think, electrical equipment in a condensing environment. So you can, but they know you shouldn't do that. So you can give people a checklist. If you make that checklist very specific, it doesn't really help because that only deals with that problem. If you make that too generic a lesson, saying quality is king or safety is paramount, then it just sort of washes over people. So you need this nice interdisciplinary intervention somewhere in the middle, which learns sufficiently from it that it then helps you at another time.
So you kind of want Goldilocks interventions, yeah? That's the.
Yeah, well.
So, sorry, carry on.
No, that's fine. So you might be able to find. So it would be interesting to know. I mean, can you game it? I mean, is the role of AI and ML in finding defeaters? So what sort of knowledge base do you need in order to find defeaters? And some of these things, like hazard analysis you can do just by asking some guide word questions. You know, what happens if this is there? What happens if it's not there? What happens if there's too much of it? What happens if, you know, so you could come up with those type of probes.
And I guess there's a kind of rich vein of work in kind of adversarial systems in machine learning as well, which might be worthwhile having a look at. But anyway, Alex has got a question now because she's the other inveterate hand raiser. So we'll hand over to Alex.
Hello, Alex.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. Yeah, so my question is about, I guess it's about argument in context, because people are really good at actually holding contradictory beliefs and using whatever beliefs are convenient for making the argument they want to make. And so when it comes to these defeaters, it is possible that you've got a defeater defeating one claim and an alternative defeater defeating another claim. And those two defeaters are kind of, they're not exactly logically inconsistent, because, you know, a theorem prover could find that, but they undermine each other. They're, you know, according to common sense, if you like, highly unlikely both to be true. And yet, when it comes to argumentation, people will use one in fact, you know, when the time is right to undermine some claim and use the other to undermine another claim at a different time. So in a sense, it's quite easy to miss links in the sort of belief set as a whole. And this is quite different from defeasible argument, where it's sort of, I'll jump to this conclusion in the absence of information to the contrary. It's more like willful blindness. There is information to the contrary, choosing to ignore it or not mention it at the time because it is convenient for you for winning the argument, right? How do you deal with that situation? Happens in politics a lot. I have to say it happens in linguistics. So in a different guise. So syntacticians, theoretical syntacticians argue like mad about two different ways of analyzing a particular phenomenon for the sake of argument, let's say, you know, island constraints. But, you know, when you embed those two things into a wide coverage handcrafted grammar, you see the unintended consequences of one analysis on a completely different phenomenon compared with another. It's the real test, and grammar engineering is what keeps linguists honest.
So that's a really interesting question, is around, to me, I would reframe it as saying, well, we've got lots of defeaters, but they're not independent. So they could be contradictory, they could be based on false assumptions, and you could have a whole defeater sort of mess here. And they could also be a great source of mischief. So exactly. Game a system, flooding it with all sorts of defeaters, as people could do with hazards. And I think we're in the early stages of the practice. So whether you'd be able to, but often I think defeaters that we get thrown at us are often quite, they're either relatively high level, so you then think, well, how do I concrete this in this case? What's it going to look like now? So you do have to do some work in establishing its role. But certainly you can have, but you can put in, but I think this independence is an issue when you start patching your argument, because you could easily address one defeater, but you'll find that it makes another one worse, and you haven't really sort of understood that. Sorry, not a very good argument, not a very good answer, but it's certainly be interesting to see as we roll this out more how that plays out.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, so now we have Alan Bundy, whose hand is up.
Right. Yes, thanks very much, Robin. Very interesting. Now, when you were talking about defeaters, it reminded me of argumentation theory, which is a branch of AI in which there's a directed graph, and the nodes represent complete arguments, and the arrows represent the relationship of this argument defeats that one. Yes. And when I listened to Alex's question, it struck me this could be a help, because if you laid out all the defeaters and the arguments and so on in such a graph, then you would spot a relationship of this defeater defeats that defeater, which is sort of what she was getting at. So I wondered if that would be a useful tool in your toolbox.
Yes, that might be. I mean, we looked, are they dung graphs? I mean, we looked at some of the argumentation theory people, and I think and I'd be great to be corrected on this, but the problem we had with those arguments was they tend to be slightly pantomime type arguments. Yes, you do, no, I didn't. Yes, you do, no, I didn't. And so the topology of the argument doesn't really tell us about the semantics of it.
Yes.
And so I found, but I think in this case, topology of argument might be really useful just to see dependence if you could identify it. But in general, I found that research more sort of missing the meaning of the argument as opposed to the structure.
Yeah, so your general approach is a multiplicity of arguments, which in which none of them is complete in themselves, but together they help. So that would sort of fit into your general methodology, I think.
Yeah, Alan, can I come in here? Because I like you, I thought, gosh, this is so much like argumentation theory. I thought that too. But, like Robin, I have a problem with argumentation theory. And it's actually, I agree with his problem, but it's a problem with, I don't think argumentation theory deals with the problem I'm talking about, which is actually discovering a missing link. You have to work to get that missing link. Someone has to put it in. And the existing automated reasoning methods don't necessarily help you do that, especially if the friction between them is based in common sense or real world knowledge rather than logic.
Yeah.
So I think there are two things. One, Alan, I wondered whether any of your work on sort of learning how people do proofs and applying that to the proofs, if I'm paraphrasing my understanding of some of the stuff you've done, but whether that would actually help them, whether we could pinch any of that to apply it to this type of argument.
Yes, it was about representing relationships between goals to be proved and methods of proving them, and seeing how the preconditions of one method fitted to the post conditions of another, and so on. So possibly, yes, I haven't really thought about that, but possibly it could, yeah.
And I think this issue of sort of finding missing links is pushing us towards. So as we make the arguments more rigorous, the question becomes, well, what are we arguing about? And so we're pushing to have more explicit models of the world. And if we have a more explicit model of the world, then that helps us discover these links, perhaps, in a way that we might not do otherwise.
The downside of that, of course, is that as you elaborate the model, it becomes more and more hard to understand. And at some point, it's no longer helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, it takes me a long time to press that button. Any more questions? I mean, I have a couple of just final little things to ask Robin, if nobody else has anything to say. One of them was to do with high assurance systems and the extent. I mean, once upon a time, there were things like safety integrity levels, or they still are there, I guess, in some standards and so on. But how do you change the approach in assurance 2, depending on the level of assurance that you require, and how do you decide about what level of assurance you really need for these sorts of things? And well, okay, I think there are other things to say, and then there was another one which has to do with production excellence, I guess, which is at least one of the arguments for, let's say, continuous integration and continuous less so, but continuous deployment, is that it continuously generates evidence about the artifact that you're producing. And how does assurance 2.0 fit with those kinds of arguments and those kinds of production processes? So I guess those are things you could give another seminar on, I know, but maybe a couple of sentences would be fine.
Well, just a couple of sentences on, well, on the continuous deployment, then there's lots of ideas, but in a sense, if you've got are you just generating the same evidence, but in many different times, different ways, or in which case your structure of your argument's the same, but the evidence is getting refreshed all the time, or assumptions might be changing. So there's a way in which hopefully you can cope with that if it's changing, but you could be discovering things which invalidate your arguments. You've got to sort of update your assumptions and things, but we would hope that the high tempo, you should be able to deal with higher tempos. The other one about levels of SIL levels and levels of assurance. Well, so part of this is you need to go from models about confidence in something and its behavior in the real world. So there's the sort of, my colleague Lorenzo and Robabs are working on those sort of models. But in particular, you need to ask, how confident do you need to be? And so there is this idea of a chain of confidence. You say, well, okay, if I'm 99% confident, well, it depends what happens if with that 1%. So what happens if you're wrong? And sometimes it doesn't matter very much. So you can say, well, if I'm wrong, I can't be that wrong. I mean, it can't fail every day, you know. So what's my, so there is this idea, and it's in one of the IA guides actually, of actually having this idea of a chain of confidence.
Okay.
But generally, people don't articulate how confident they have to be in a decision, because they don't really look at what's the impact of them being wrong in that way.
Okay, good. There was one thing I was going to say that came up during your meeting, during your talk, and that was about data, not having looked at data very much. And have you talked to the National Physical Laboratory people, the data metrology people there?
No, we haven't. I mean, it was a bit of an easy win in sense of looking at the nuclear regulations and just saying, well, look, actually, data is a first-class object. It's clearly important, and you know, historically, it's important. You know, physics codes and things. You've got to maintain data, but it's not addressed as a central issue. And so you know, systems are the data. You know, what about generating systems on the fly? All that, no. So we haven't actually followed this up, but they would be.
Yeah, I think Alistair Forbes is the lead there.
Okay.
Yeah, because they've done quite a bit of work on provenance, and they're looking at kind of trying to have reference collections for certain industries and so on. Yeah.
And it was interesting that the Information Commissioner has done a nice summary of assurance cases and claims arguments evidence for in their domain as well. So I think people are looking for that type of framework for reasoning, but you've then got to instantiate it properly.
Yeah.
So we've looked at it from a security point of view, but
This is becoming less like a seminar and more like a conversation between you and me. So I get no, it's okay. So I guess I mean I'm interested in it. We should probably carry it on at some point, but we should also just say thank you to you again and let you go, unless anybody has anything else that they want to ask. Yeah, and we'll all applaud again in a appropriate way. Yeah. Okay.
Good. Well, thanks.
So, thanks. That's great. Yeah, very nice.
Good to see you again, Stuart. Good. Bye,
okay.
everybody. Cheers.
Bye now. Bye.